Hey everybody, welcome. It is Caleb. In this video, we're going to use React to consume an API. This is my first React video. I thought I'd switch it up and do some front-end development. So what this is going to do is it's just going to take some data from an API and display it on a page. And this is all going to be a single page application style, so there's not going to be any refreshes. The page will dynamically change when there's new data. So let me show you what the application is actually going to look like so you know what we'll be building. So pretty simple design, obviously. Pretty much it'll give us something random to do when we're bored, and we have the option to load another. It'll do a little loading thing and then give us something else to do. That's the simple version we're going to start out with, but by the end of this video, we'll have a version that'll actually add elements to a list. So here's how this version will work. You hit load, the button becomes disabled. It will then load a new value and then re-enable the button. You can continue to hit this button as many times as you want to get some new information. So the purpose of the app is kind of silly, but it goes through a lot of valuable principles with React as well as consuming an API. We're using boardapi.com, which will give us a random activity. So we're going to use this API, and it's really nice because you don't have to create an account or use any API key. So let's get started. I'll assume a very minimal understanding of React. We'll go through everything in as much detail as needed. So for the complete beginner, you're going to need to download Node.js, and this will give us a valuable tool that we can use in the terminal, npx, and it's a little tiny, so let me zoom in. And what this will do is it'll allow us to create an application for React very easily by saying create-react-app. So npx create React app, and then give it a name such as API. This will give you a starter application, which you can then go edit. Once that's done, you'll have a new folder, so you can say cd API to change into that directory, and then npm start. This will open a web browser with that application. So here we are. This is the default, and you can see we're on localhost 3004. Yours will most likely be 3000. If you have multiple applications running, it'll prompt you if you want to run on a different port. I hit yes. So we have this API directory now, and then the source directory, and everything starts inside of index.js, which renders this app component here, which you can see in app.js, and this is going to return the HTML that's necessary to display this page. So what we can do is, instead of rendering all this stuff, we could just render our own component. So I'm going to clear out everything in this return, and now we're going to create our own component that we can render anywhere inside of our application. So we'll leave this for just a second, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder. We'll just call it components, and inside of components, we're going to create a new file. You can call it whatever you want, but this is an app for getting various activities. So I'm just going to call it activities.js. So the activities component's job is going to be to grab a new activity for when we're bored. So to create this, we're going to create a function called activities. And this is just going to return some HTML. We'll just start with an h1, and we'll just say something fun. And at the bottom of the file here, we'll say export default activities, like so. And what this will do is it'll allow us to use this activities file in another file, such as app.js. So right here, we can say return activities, and it looks like that automatically imported it. So you'll just need to say import activities from, and then the path to that file. So dot for the current directory, and then into the components directory, and then activities. Now it ends in a .js, but that is not required here, so you can leave that off for JavaScript files. So let's take a look back at our page, and you can see we get something fun. Now we're not going to really do CSS a whole lot in this video. There's just one change I wanted to make, which is this lack of margin is kind of driving me crazy. So we're going to go into index.css and just get rid of margin 0, which makes it look a little prettier. But that shows you how you can edit the CSS as well. So I think that's all the files we're going to need at the moment. So we'll close that, close out of the CSS. And now all we have to do is work inside of this activities component. So what I want to do now is create the function to request information from the API, and then we'll talk about how to get that to display in the page. So we'll just create a function. We'll actually define it inside of this other function, which is totally okay to do inside of JavaScript. And we'll just call this load activity. Now for this, we're going to be using fetch and you can see some information about fetch here and some boilerplate code. Basically, we're going to pass in the URL, then we're going to get the JSON from the response, and then we're going to log that data. So we'll just take this as an example, or if you're just following along, you can write it out. It's not that much code, no big deal. And once we do this, we'll be able to replace this URL with the URL to get the activities. This is the API endpoint. So we'll go back to that, which is boardapi.com/API/activity. So we'll copy that and we'll paste that right here. All right, so we have that function, and you can see we get a warning, load activity is defined but never used. We're going to use something from React to execute this function as soon as the page loads. So to do that, we're going to say import, and inside of curly braces, useEffect from React. So once the page is loaded in the browser, we want to then make a request and update that page. That's what useEffect is for. So we will put this probably right here, so before this return down here, and we will say useEffect, and inside of the argument list, we're going to use an anonymous function, which the syntax will look like this. And then inside of this code, we can just invoke load activity. There we go. So now let's take a look at our page. We go back to our React app, and we're going to right click, inspect, go into the console. We now have this object here, which is the actual activity. And when we refresh, it'll load and it'll show that activity. This API is fairly slow because it's free, I'm assuming. So just give us some time, but eventually we'll get that activity, and every time we do a refresh, we'll get a new one. So we got the activity to load, and pretty much what's going to happen now is someone will visit the page. It can say something like loading. While it gets that information, which can take some time, and then bring it back, it will then update the page. So that is what you use useEffect for. And in React, this is known as the effect hook. It's an example of a hook, which you can do more research on. Now, in our code, you could just put all this function code inside of this anonymous function here, but we're going to actually reuse this load activity to load more of them, and it just seemed cleaner to me to do it this way. So how do we actually get this information to show up on the page? Well, instead of console logging data, what we can do is we can store this data in state. So state is basically the information that we want to work with on our web page, and you can actually put a comma after useEffect here and say useState. So the way this is going to work is you're going to invoke useState, and this is going to return two values, so we can assign it to two variables, like so, using square brackets, and put the first variable followed by the second variable. So this is the thing we want to store, so we'll just call it the activity. And then that second variable is how we can update the actual activity state. So we'll call that set activity. And then we'll assign it useState. Inside of the parentheses here is the default state, so we'll just use an empty array. Now, if you've never seen this before, this can be really confusing. As I mentioned, I'm just getting started with React videos, so I haven't been doing this very long, and when I first learned about this, I was like, what is going on? But once you got it down, it's not too bad. Pretty much, we're going to refer to the actual activity using this variable, and then if we want to update it, we will invoke a function setActivity. So to see that in action, we'll replace this console.log with setActivity, and inside of parentheses, we will put the actual data we want to use. So it returned data, and on that data object, there is an activity property you can see here in the terminal. So we will put data.activity. And as I mentioned, you can use the activity variable here to refer to whatever is in that state. So we could put that inside of the H1, and to actually render JavaScript inside of the H1, we use curly braces here, and we'll just put that variable activity. We'll go back to our web page, and you can see our activity shows up inside of the H1. We do a refresh. It's white for a second, but eventually it'll show up. learn express.js and do another refresh. And just to show you guys, these are totally random. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, the page loads, then this function gets executed, which will then load an activity and update the state with that new activity value. We then grab that state inside of the H1, which we are returning in the JSX code down here. Let's just make the experience a little bit better. We're going to actually create a button, which will say load more. And when we want to return multiple things, we will just surround it in parentheses, and then we'll put everything in one single HTML tag, such as a div. So let me take this and put it after the button. We don't need that semicolon there. And then let's just do some formatting, and there we go, it looks good. So we're returning a div with an H1 and a button. So far it looks like this. It will say the value. Now if you watch this, you'll notice some auto refreshing, which is a mistake on my part. You'll actually want to add a separate argument to useEffect, which is going to be an empty array. And this is called a dependency array. You can research that, but that's going to prevent it from just automatically reloading. Now when we load another, nothing actually happens. So what we need to do is we need to make it so that when we click this button, it'll actually execute that same function that we have up here to fetch new data. So to do this, there will be an attribute on button, on click, and we will set this equal to, inside of curly braces, the function name, load activity. Let's give it a try. Load another, and it'll refresh it. The last thing I want to do is make it say loading while it's loading, so we don't just click load another 50 times and cause the application to explode. You can see when you do that, it just kind of freaks out. So to keep track of whether or not it's loading, we can use state similar to how we did right here. So we'll copy this and paste it, but instead of activity now, it's going to be is loading. And same process, set is loading. And there we go. The default value for this, it's by default going to be true. So we want it to say is loading first thing. Now what we can do is we can conditionally return something else if it is loading. So we'll say if is loading, and then in here we're going to just return, I don't know, paragraph loading. So by default it's just going to say loading ... and stay that way forever because we don't actually have any code to change it to false. So when would we change it to false? Probably after we get some data back. So in this then here, what we can do is add another line here. So let's just space this out some. I'm going to make a little code block like so. And then what we can do is just say set is loading using this function right here and pass in false. And then same thing when we click the button. So we click load activity, we want loading to be set back to true. So we can just do that at the very top up here. Set is loading and set that to true. All right, let's try it out. So it says loading, give it a second. Ah, there we go, make a new friend. Load another, loading, write a short story. All right, so that's V1 of the application. Next up, I want to actually keep a list of all the values and not replace everything each time. So instead of the HTML switching to loading, we're just going to make that button be disabled and add to the HTML. So I think the first thing I want to change is instead of working with a single activity, I want to work with multiple activities. And the default state here is an empty array, which I guess I was forward thinking, as originally we wouldn't have needed an array just using a single activity. However, now that we're going to be working with multiple activities, that makes a little bit more sense. So we'll switch this to set activities just to be consistent. And now we'll just go through and update the words. But this set activities is going to replace everything inside of the activities state. So how do we actually append to the state to increase the list size instead of replace everything? Well, what we can do is we can pass in an array, and what is going to go inside of this array? So the first thing we want in this array is the original activities. So we'll say activities, and you can grab each element using 3 dots at the beginning. So this is how you can say, put each element from the activities array right here. And then we can add another element after a comma, which is going to be coming from the actual JSON. So we'll say data.activity. There we go. I think everything's spelled right so far. We just have to go down to our HTML, and instead of printing a single activity, we actually need to put multiple activities, which can be a little bit more complicated. What we're going to do is we're going to create an unordered list, and inside of here we're going to create some code to loop through all the elements. So to do this, we'll just say activities.map. And what this will do is it'll allow us to execute a function for each element inside of activities. So we'll just do an anonymous function here. And all we're going to do is return a list item. To get the actual activity, we need a parameter here, activity. So it'll go through this activities array, and each iteration, the activity will be in this variable. We can access it using the activity variable here. So let's take a look. Do a refresh here. It says loading. It gives us 1 element. Load another, and it gives us 2. Load another, 3. Awesome. So far, so good. It's not perfect. We're going to improve it. We're also going to fix this error here. Each child in the list should have a unique key prop. So this is a thing with React where to distinguish the different activities, we need some unique identifier. So we're going to have basically a key with some value right here. Now the actual API does have a key for the values. So if we go back, you can see there's key with some number in a string. So to grab this, instead of working with the activity value directly, we're actually going to work with the activity objects. So we'll just do the entire object there. And this is going to change our code just a little bit. We now need to, since this is going to be the entire object, this entire thing, we need to be a little bit more specific and say we want this attribute. So we'll go over and say dot activity. And then for the key, we can say activity dot key. So I think that should work. Let's go over to our code, check it out. We'll clear the console and do a refresh to make sure everything's good. And there we go. We're not getting any errors about the key, and our code should work exactly the same way. Now what I want to do is I want to change it so that instead of showing loading every single time, it only shows loading if there are no activities. Otherwise, we could just expand on the list. We don't have to replace everything. So we can just say activities dot length. If this is equal to 0, then we will say loading. Otherwise, there's no point in it. So let's try this. We'll do a refresh. It says loading. There we go. Load another. And you can see it loads that information without changing the HTML a whole lot. It looks a lot better. The only thing now is to disable this button, because I can click this like 50 times and we don't know if it's replacing values. We don't want to do this. So to do this, we can actually condition on if it's loading whether or not we want this button to be disabled. So we'll go back to our HTML, and there is an attribute on here, disabled, which you can get from is loading. Just like we were doing before to load the HTML, well now we're just going to do it for the button. So if it's loading, we want the button to be disabled. So let's try that now. Load another, the button goes disabled, so I can't click it anymore, and it just loads 1 element. We do a refresh, and it properly says loading at the beginning. So there you go. That is the application. So far, so good. Let's see what you can do with this. This is just how to do a GET request. Obviously, as you continue your application building, you'll need to learn how to send data to a server. So this is just the bare basics. So I wanted this video to not necessarily be an introduction to React, although I hope that was part of it. I wanted it to be how to consume an API as simply as possible, direct to the point. So hopefully this taught you how to do it. I think I'm going to look into using Redux and some different approaches to making a request to an API. That might be a little bit better, so stay tuned for some upcoming videos if you want to learn more about full stack web development. We also have some Python backend videos, and we'll probably be doing some front end consumption of an API in a little bit more detail for my upcoming Python backend course. It's a backend course, yes, but part of that is understanding how to consume the API, so we'll look into that as well. If that's something you're interested in, I have links in the pinned comment to get early access to the notes so you can follow along, and you'll be notified through email when the course is actually released. If you have any suggestions on how to make this application better, or any magical React tricks and tips, drop them in the comment section below, and stay tuned for upcoming episodes. Peace out.